There is a temple in Nagoya, Japan called Oshu Kannon. Inside its archives sits the oldest surviving manuscript of a book called the Kojiki, a chronicle of Japan's origins first compiled in 712 CE. The specific copy held there, known as the Shinpuku-jibon, was hand-copied by a Buddhist priest between 1371 and 1372 CE. Runs to 3 volumes. It is the closest thing the world has to the original text. The Kojiki is the foundational document of the Japanese imperial line, and what it claims in plain prose is that the family currently occupying the Chrysanthemum Throne descends in an unbroken line from beings who came down from the sky. It names them. It dates the descent. It identifies the mountain where they landed, was dictated by a court reciter named Hieda no A, and transcribed by a scribe named Ono Yasumaro on the order of Empress Genmai. What happens when you read it not as mythology, but as what it appears to be, is one of the strangest unresolved questions in the history of Japan. Kojiki is not a long text by Western standards, roughly 30,000 Japanese characters in its original form, divided into 3 volumes. The first volume, the Kamitsumaki, deals entirely with what the Japanese call Kamiyo, the age of the gods. The second and third cover the human emperors, from the legendary first ruler Jimmu through the early 7th century CE. The language is Old Japanese rendered phonetically using Chinese characters, a difficult hybrid orthography that took centuries of philological work to decode. The orthodox dating treats the document itself as the product of an 8th century political project. The Yamato court, consolidating power in the Nara period, commissioned a written national history to anchor its legitimacy. The Kojiki was completed in 712 CE. 8 years later, in 720 CE, a longer and more Chinese-influenced chronicle called the Nihon Shoki was finished. Together, they form the canonical account, but the genealogy these texts record is not from the 8th century. They claim to preserve oral traditions that were already ancient. They name a specific sequence of heavenly beings who existed before humans. They describe a specific act of descent, a being named Ninigi no Mikoto, the grandson of the sun goddess Amaterasu, coming down from a place called Takamagahara, the plain of high heaven, to a peak in what is now Kyushu. They name his great-great-grandson Jimmu as the first earthly emperor, and date his accession to a specific day, what the modern calendar places as February 11th, 660 BCE. That date is still observed as a Japanese national holiday. The genealogy from Jimmu to the current emperor, Naruhito, is presented as unbroken across 126 generations. Claim is falsifiable in principle and has never been refuted on its own terms. If you find that the standard account of how the Japanese imperial line came to be, the textbook version about a useful 8th century myth, leaves the specifics of the document strangely unaddressed, this channel is for that question. Subscribe only if that's the kind of work you've been looking for. The rest of us continue. Mainstream historical reading of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki is straightforward, and, by the standards of textual criticism, well supported, runs as follows. By the late 7th century CE, the Yamato clan had emerged as the dominant political power on the Japanese archipelago. Political logic of consolidation demanded a written national history of the kind possessed by the Chinese imperial court. Empress Genmai commissioned the project. Hieda no a court reciter trained to memorize royal genealogies, dictated the material. No Yasumaro committed it to writing. The result was a chronicle that performed 2 simultaneous functions. It preserved a body of oral tradition that almost certainly was ancient, and it shaped that tradition into a narrative that legitimized Yamato rule, the conventional view, articulated by scholars including the 20th century Japanologist Donald Keene, the linguist Roy Andrew Miller, and the 18th century scholar Motori Norinaga in his monumental Kojiki-den commentary, treats the age of the gods material as a syncretic theological narrative. The heavenly beings, Amaterasu, Susanoo, Tsukuyomi, Ninigi, no Mikoto, are read as personifications of natural forces and clan ancestral figures absorbed into the imperial cult. Descent from Takamagahara is read as a political theology, a way of asserting that the Yamato emperors are not first among equals, but a separate, sanctified line. Specific date of 660 BCE for Jimmu's accession is treated as a back calculation, possibly derived from Chinese sexagenary cycles, designed to give the imperial house a venerable antiquity. This reading is internally consistent. It explains a great deal. It is the reading taught in Japanese universities and in Western academic Japanology. Under this view, the Kojiki is not a record of literal descent from sky beings. It is a sophisticated piece of 8th century political literature that drew on genuinely old myth cycles to do specific political work. There is no need, under this reading, for anything to have descended from anywhere. The story is doing the work that stories of divine kingship do, in cultures from Egypt to Sumer to Mesoamerica. Break in the conventional reading happens in the specifics. The moments when the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki provide details that exceed what a back-calculated political theology would need to invent, begins with a man named Kiyomaru Takenouchi. He was a Shinto priest from Toyama Prefecture, born in 1875, and the heir to a family that had served as keepers of a body of documents called, for centuries, the Takenouchi Monjo. The Takenouchi Documents, 1928. Takenouchi publicly released portions of these documents. They presented themselves as something the conventional reading of the Kojiki could not absorb. According to the Takenouchi material, the imperial line did not begin with Ninigi no Mikoto's descent to Kyushu. It began far earlier, with a sequence of cosmic-era rulers whose reigns extended across vast spans of time, a structure that maps strikingly onto the antediluvian king lists of Mesopotamia. This is the moment the conventional reading breaks, not because the Takenouchi documents are accepted. Most Japanese scholars consider them a modern composition, or at best heavily reworked by Takenouchi himself. But because their structure repeats a pattern that has no business appearing twice independently. 8 pre-flood Sumerian kings on the Well-Blundell prism, held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, are recorded as reigning for a combined 241,200 years. The Takenouchi material describes a comparable era of pre-human cosmic rulers in Japan. The orthodox Kojiki itself, more soberly, records 7 generations of heavenly kami before Ninigi no Mikoto's descent. A sequence with no internal timescale, but presented as occupying its own era distinct from human history. The methodological work matters here. The Takenouchi material in its surviving copies is suspect, but the question that no peer-reviewed Japanese scholar has answered to the satisfaction of the forensic-minded reader is why the orthodox texts, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, whose authenticity is uncontested, preserve the same fundamental structure. Pre-human era, beings descending from a sky realm, specific landing point on a specific mountain, direct genealogical transmission from those beings to a still-living royal house. That structure is not unique to Japan. It is also not generic. It is the same specific structure preserved in Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, and other Near Eastern sources separated from Japan by 7,000 kilometers of land and sea. The physical anchor in Japan is provided by a separate line of research. The underwater monument at Yonaguni, off the southwestern tip of the Ryukyu archipelago. The monument was first identified by a Japanese diver named Kihachiro Aratake in 1986. Subsequent investigation by Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, has produced multiple peer-reviewed papers arguing that the structure shows signs of human modification. Kimura is not a fringe figure. He has published in mainstream geological journals. Robert Schoch, the Boston University geologist who weather-dated the Great Sphinx, has examined the site and reached a more cautious conclusion, that the monument is primarily natural, but may have been modified. If Yonaguni was modified, the date of its submergence places that works somewhere between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 BCE. Long before any culture conventionally believed to inhabit Japan was supposed to be capable of it. Break is here. The Kojiki names sky-descended ancestors. The seafloor off Okinawa contains a structure that may not be natural. The orthodox timeline does not have room for either claim taken at face value. What does it mean, taken seriously? Begin with the structure. The Kojiki names a sequence of 7 generations of heavenly kami before Ninigi no Mikoto's descent to Earth. Ninigi is the great-great-grandfather of Jimmu, who founds the human imperial line in 660 BCE. The genealogy then runs unbroken through 126 emperors to the present day. Current Emperor Naruhito, who acceded in 2019, is presented as the direct lineal descendant of a being who came down from the plane of high heaven onto a mountain in southern Kyushu. If that genealogy is even partially accurate as a record of an actual transmission, not necessarily of divinity, but of a memory of contact, then several specific things follow. The first is geographic. The Kojiki names Mount Takachiho as the landing site of Ninigi. There are 2 candidate peaks for this: Takachiho no Mini in Miyazaki Prefecture and the Takachiho Gorge in the same region. The texts also name Hyuga as the territory where Ninigi's descendants ruled before Jimmu's eastward migration to the Yamato plain near present-day Nara. The route of that migration is described in detail in both the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. By sea up the inland sea, by land through what is now Osaka and into the Yamato Basin. Route is real geography. Every named landing point exists. Several have continuously operating Shinto shrines that predate the 8th century compilation by an unknown margin. The Ai's Grand Shrine, dedicated to Amaterasu, has been at its present site since approximately 4 BCE by its own traditional dating, and the main sanctuary is ritually rebuilt every 20 years in a ceremony called the Shikinen Sengu, an unbroken practice maintained for over 13 centuries. The second is material. 3 objects are named in the Kojiki as the regalia that Ninigi no Mikoto brought down from Takamagahara: the Yata no Kagami, a sacred mirror, Kusanagi no Tsurugi, a sacred sword, and the Yasakani no Magatama, a sacred jewel. These 3 objects, the Sanshu no Jingi, are claimed to still exist. Mirror is housed at the Ice Grand Shrine. The sword is housed at the Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya, the same city by an unrelated proximity that holds the oldest Kojiki manuscript at Osu Canon. The jewel is held at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. No emperor in recent memory has actually seen them. They are presented at enthronement ceremonies, wrapped in cloth, their containers passed from priest to emperor. Even Naruhito, at his accession ceremony in 2019, received the containers without opening them. If you want to check this, the protocol is public. The locations are public. The object's physical existence is asserted by the Imperial Household Agency and has never been independently photographed or radiocarbon dated. The third implication is chronological. The genealogy from Jimmu to Naruhito covers 2,600 years, if read literally. That is, a longer continuous documented imperial line than any other in the world. British monarchy traces continuous succession back roughly 1,200 years to Alfred the Great. The Ethiopian Solomonic line claimed roughly 3,000 years, but was interrupted multiple times. The Yamato line, according to its own records, has never been interrupted. No replacement, no usurpation, no foreign dynasty. Mainstream historians regard the first 10 or so emperors as legendary, but the genealogical line from Emperor Sujin or Orjin onward, roughly the 3rd or 4th century CE, is accepted as historical. That alone is approximately 1700 years of unbroken father-to-son or close relation succession. There is no parallel for it. The fourth implication is cross-cultural. The Kojiki's account of Ninigi no Mikoto's descent has a direct, structural parallel in the Korean foundation myth of Dangun, recorded in a 13th century Korean text called the Samguk Yusa. In that account, a heavenly being named Hwanung descends from heaven. With 3,000 followers and 3 seals of office to Mount Taebaek, marries an earthly woman, and fathers Dangun, the founder of the Korean nation, in a year corresponding to 2333 BCE. The Korean and Japanese myths are not the same. Their architecture is identical. Heavenly being, descent to a named mountain, 3 sacred objects of regal authority, foundation of a royal line that traces directly to the descending being. You can extend the parallel further. The Sumerian king list, on the weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood for a combined 241,200 years. After the flood, the list resumes with progressively shorter reigns and connects the antediluvian kingship to historical Mesopotamian dynasties. The structural template is again the same. A celestial or semi-celestial era, a transition event, and a continuous lineage that survives into recorded history follows. If you treat the Japanese material as an instance of this template rather than an isolated curiosity, is that conventional history needs an account of why the template recurs. The standard answer: independent invention, the universality of foundation myths, would be satisfactory if the parallels were generic. Parallels are not generic, they are specific. 3 sacred objects, descent from a named celestial location, a named mountain landing site, direct genealogical chain, a specific date for the inception of the human period. If you want to verify any of this for yourself, the relevant material is openly accessible. The Kojiki has been in print in English since Basil Hall Chamberlain's translation in 1882, with newer scholarly translations by Donald Philippi and Gustav Held. Nihon Shoki was translated by William George Aston in 1896 and remains in print. The Samguk Yusa is available in Korean and in scholarly translation. Weld Blundell Prism's transcription was published by Stephen Langdon in 1923. None of this is secret. None of it is hidden. The question is what to do with the pattern. Academic response in Japan is more interesting than the academic response in the West, because the political stakes are different. The conventional Japanese university position on the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki was established in the post-war period and is shaped by the trauma of state Shinto. From the Meiji Restoration in 1868 through the surrender in 1945, the imperial cult was the official ideology of the Japanese state. Children were taught the Kojiki's genealogy as literal history. Emperor Hirohito was officially divine. The catastrophe of the war produced an academic correction so severe that any treatment of the imperial origins as anything other than constructed myth became professionally unsafe. In 1946, Hirohito, under American pressure, issued the Ningen Sengen, the Humanity Declaration, formally renouncing his divinity. The new academic consensus that crystallized in the following decades treated the entire age of the gods material, and the early emperors through at least the legendary emperor Sujin, as fabrication. Tsuda Sokichi, the historian who had argued before the war that the early imperial narratives were political constructions and had been prosecuted for lèse-majesté for it, was rehabilitated. His reading became orthodoxy. The pendulum did not just swing, it locked. This is the form of the dismissal. Kojiki's specific claims, the named mountain, the three regalia, the unbroken genealogy, the structural parallel with continental king lists, are not engaged with on their merits. They are categorized. They belong to a body of material that was misused by a militarist state. To take them seriously as historical evidence is to risk being read as a sympathizer with that state's ideology. The dismissal, therefore, operates by association rather than by argument. No peer-reviewed Japanese paper has published a refutation of the specific structural correspondence between the Kojiki's descent narrative and the comparable Sumerian, Korean, or Hebrew accounts, because no peer-reviewed Japanese paper has treated the question as worth asking. In the West, the dismissal takes a different form. Kojiki is studied as literature and as the foundational document of Shinto, but rarely as a possible record of contact with anything external to the Japanese cultural sphere. When Western Japanologists do address the parallels with other cultures' descent narratives, the explanation defaults to two options. First is diffusion. The idea that contact between continental Asia and the Japanese archipelago in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE could have transmitted templates. The second is Jungian or structuralist. The idea that human cultures independently generate similar foundation myths because of shared cognitive architecture. Both explanations have a problem. They do not engage with the specifics. Diffusion can plausibly transmit a general template, but it does not explain why the Japanese version preserves 3 specific regalia objects that match the 3 seals of office in the Korean Dangun account so closely. Structuralism explains generic patterns but not specific correspondences. Neither explanation has been written as a focused response to the question the alternative researchers are actually asking, which is whether the parallels are evidence of a shared historical event. The asymmetry argument applies here as it does in Mesopotamian studies. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. Kojiki has been characterized as state cult literature, as foundation myth, as Shinto theology, as political ideology. It has not been refuted as a record of something that happened. To refute it on those grounds would require showing why a continuous documented genealogy preserved in 2 independent 8th century chronicles, anchored to specific geography, supported by 3 claimed material objects, and structurally parallel to comparable narratives across the Asian continent, can be fully accounted for by any of the conventional explanations. That refutation has not been published. What has been published is silence. Silence interrupted by the occasional documentary in which a Western archaeologist describes the imperial origins as the founding myth of Japan, without examining what the myth specifically says. The named establishment figures who have most carefully studied the texts, Donald Keene, Roy Andrew Miller, Gustav Held, treat them as literature. They are not dishonest. They are not engaged in suppression. They are simply working within an academic framework in which the question of whether the Kojiki records a literal descent is not a question that can be professionally asked. Framework is what the alternative researchers contest. Framework, more than any individual scholar, is the dismissal. To understand what the Kojiki is and what it claims, you have to understand the world that produced it. The Yamato plain in the early 8th century CE was a landscape of rice paddies and forested hills cut by rivers, dotted with the keyhole-shaped burial mounds called kafun that mark the graves of the early emperors. The largest of these, the Daisen Kofun in modern Osaka Prefecture, is attributed to Emperor Ninku and measures approximately 486 meters in length. It is one of the largest burial monuments in the world by volume, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza in surface footprint, and its excavation is forbidden by Japanese law. The Imperial Household Agency maintains all major imperial tombs as active religious sites. They have not been archaeologically opened, lies inside the Daisen Kofun, and inside the dozens of other major imperial tumuli is unknown. This restriction is not incidental. It is one of the central facts of Japanese archaeology. The country with one of the longest continuously claimed royal lines on Earth is also the country in which the physical evidence of that line, the burial goods, the body of the founder emperors, any inscriptions that might survive, is held inaccessible by religious political consensus. Foreign archaeologist who wants to enter a kofun does not file a permit application and wait. There is no permit. Even Japanese archaeologists work on the periphery. Pottery shards from outside the moat, surface surveys of the slopes. The interior is closed. It has been closed since the Meiji period codified imperial tomb protection in 1874. What we know about the early imperial period therefore comes almost entirely from texts. Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are the primary sources. They are supplemented by the Fudoki, provincial gazetteers compiled in the early 8th century at imperial order, which preserve local traditions about the era of the gods that the central chronicles edited or omitted. Fudoki for Izumo, in particular, preserves a distinct theological tradition centered on Susanoo and his descendants, suggesting that the unified imperial mythology assembled in Nara was constructed from at least two regional traditions, a southern Kyushu tradition centered on the Amaterasu Ninigi line, and a western Honshu tradition centered on Izumo. Figure of Susanoo is worth pausing on. He is Amaterasu's brother. Kojiki describes him as turbulent, exiled from Takamagahara for various transgressions, ultimately descended to earth at a place called Torikami in Izumo. There he encounters an earthly couple in distress, because their daughters have been devoured, one, by an 8-headed serpent named Yamato no Orochi. Susanoo kills the serpent, and from its tail he draws a sword. That sword is the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the same sword that generations later the Kojiki claims his descendants passed to Amaterasu, who places it among the 3 regalia given to Ninigi no Mikoto, who carries it down to Kyushu, the same sword that is claimed to be in the Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya today. This is the level of internal coherence that the orthodox political theology reading has to absorb. It is not impossible. Composite mythologies in many cultures show similar coherence, but it is striking. And the alternative researcher's point is precisely that the striking specificity of the narrative is what the orthodox reading dismisses without engaging. Step back to the cosmology. The world of the Kojiki has 3 layers. Takamagahara is the high plane of heaven where the kami reside. Ashihara no Nakatsukuni, the central reed plain land, is the human earth. Yomi is the underworld, where the dead go. Movement between the layers is possible but difficult. The descents from Takamagahara are described not as appearances or visions, but as physical journeys. Ninigi no Mikoto, when he comes down. He arrives at a peak. He is accompanied by a retinue of named subordinates, whose own descendants become specific aristocratic clans of historical Japan. The Nakatomi, the Imbe, the Sarume clans were still operating, with names and territorial holdings. When the Kojiki was compiled, imagine the scene that the compilers were preserving, whatever it actually was. Whether literal arrival or syncretized memory of ancient migration, the structure they were given was that a group of named beings descended from somewhere above, landed at a named peak, were accompanied by named retainers and founded named lineages. The compilers in Nara did not invent that structure freely, they received it. Question is what they received it from. The early imperial reigns, those of Suinin, Keiko, Seimu, Chuai, read like the reigns of mortal kings doing mortal things, with the difference that their lifespans, as the Nihon Shoki records them, are implausibly long. Emperor Suin reigned, according to the Nihon Shoki, for 99 years, and lived to the age of 140. Emperor Kiko to 143. Emperor Koan to 137. These are not the lifespans of historical figures. They are the lifespans of the antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list, scaled down from the tens of thousands of years that Mesopotamian tradition assigns to its earliest rulers, but still operating in a register above the human. Japanese chronology approaches the period when external Chinese and Korean sources begin to mention the Yamato court. The late 4th and 5th centuries CE. The lifespans drop sharply into normal human range and stay there. The Sumerian parallel is too clean to ignore. In Mesopotamia, the antediluvian kings reign for tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the reigns drop into the centuries. By the time of historically verified Mesopotamian kings, Sargon of Akkad and his successors, the reigns are normal. The Japanese material has the same structure scaled down. Pre-Jimmu beings outside time, early human emperors with century-plus lifespans, later emperors with ordinary lifespans. Whatever cultural logic governs this scaling, it is shared across thousands of kilometers and an apparent absence of direct transmission. The atmosphere of the Kojiki itself, read in any of its modern translations, is unlike most religious texts. It is dry, it is genealogical, it does not preach, it does not allegorize, it lists. It says that this being begat that being, who married that being, who went to that place and did that act. Dryness is what the alternative researchers point to. Religious literature, in the propagandistic register, does not read this way. Kojiki reads like a record that someone at some point was trying to preserve as facts. Whether the record is accurate is a separate question. Whether it was originally meant as factual is the prior question. The dry genealogical register suggests that it was. The closest Western analogue in tone is not the Bible in full. It is the early Genesis chapters and the chronicles of the Hebrew text, where extended genealogies are likewise preserved with apparent factual intent. The early Genesis chapters, too, contain a sky descent narrative. The sons of God descending to take wives among the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6. The Book of Enoch, expanded from that material in Ethiopian Orthodox canon, names the descenders. They are described as having taught arts and given offspring, who became the giants of antiquity. The structural template recurs again. Sky beings named individuals, descent, mixed lineage, founding of a recognized human population that traces back to the event. Kojiki is not the Book of Enoch. The cultural contexts are different, the theology is different, but the structural pattern they share, despite the absence of any plausible direct transmission between them, is something the orthodox readings of either text have not satisfactorily explained. Clearest external corroboration of the Kojiki's template comes from across the Korea Strait. The artifact in question is a printed book held at the Kyujangak Institute in Seoul, an academic archive at Seoul National University. The book is the Samguk Yusa, the memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms. Specific edition held at the Kyujangak was printed in 1512 from blocks carved during the Joseon dynasty, but the text itself was compiled around 1281 CE by a Buddhist monk named Irion. What the Samguk Yusa preserves in its opening section is the foundation account of the Korean people. The structure should now sound familiar. A heavenly being named Hwanung, the son of the celestial ruler Huanin, desires to descend to the earthly realm. He receives permission from his father. He descends with 3,000 followers and 3 heavenly seals to the top of Mount Taboak, a peak in the Paektu range on the present-day Korean-Chinese border. He establishes a city there called Sinsi, the City of God. He brings with him knowledge of 360 arts essential to human civilization: agriculture, medicine, governance, language. He marries an earthly woman, who, in the version Irion preserves, had been a bear transformed into human form. Their son is Dangun, the founder of the first Korean kingdom, Gojoseon. The date the Samguk Yusa gives for Dangun's accession is 2333 BCE. Compare the elements: heavenly being descends to a named mountain, 3 sacred items of authority, accompanied by a retinue, marries an earthly being, fathers a son who founds the royal line. The royal line continues into recorded human history. The architecture is identical to the Japanese template. The objects are different: 3 seals rather than mirror, sword and jewel, and the supporting cast is different. But the bones of the narrative are the same. The Samguk Yusa is older than the Kojiki by several centuries in compilation date. Wait, that is wrong directionally. Samguk Yusa was compiled later than the Kojiki, in the late 13th century, but the traditions it draws on were transmitted orally, and through earlier lost compilations for many generations before. The Korean academic position, like the Japanese, treats the Hwanung Dangun narrative as foundation myth. The exact date of 2333 BCE is observed as a national holiday in both South and North Korea, called Gaishenjeol, the festival of the opening of heaven. Now extend the comparison. The Mongolian traditions preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, a 13th century chronicle, open with a similar template. A blue-grey wolf descended from heaven, mating with the fallow deer, founding the lineage that produces Genghis Khan. The Manchu Foundation account preserved in Qing Imperial records describes a heavenly maiden descending to a lake, eating a red fruit, and bearing the ancestor of the Imperial Icene Gyoro clan. The Ainu of northern Japan preserve a tradition of Ioina, a culture hero who descended from the sky world to teach the first humans. These are not minor cultures. They are the foundational accounts of major civilizations spanning continental Northeast Asia and the Japanese archipelago, a region of approximately 7 million square kilometers, with populations who speak unrelated language families, and whose contact with each other in the period before written history is documented only fragmentarily. Structural correspondence across them in this specific configuration of sky descent, named landing site, sacred objects, and continuous lineage, is what the orthodox diffusion and structuralism account has not adequately addressed. If you want to verify this, the texts are available. The Samguk Yusa has been translated into English by Harte Hung and Grafton K. Mintz, and is in print. The Secret History of the Mongols has multiple scholarly translations. The Ainu oral traditions have been preserved by Japanese ethnographers, particularly Kyosuk Kindaichi, in publications dating from the early 20th century onward. None of this material is hidden. The question is what it adds up to. The strongest objection to reading the Kojiki as anything more than political theology was made most forcefully by the historian Tsuda Sokichi in the 1920s. Tsuda's argument has been refined and extended by subsequent scholars, and it remains the spine of the academic consensus position. The argument runs as follows. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were both compiled in the early 8th century, at a court that was actively constructing a centralized state on the Chinese model. The Chinese imperial historiographical tradition required that any legitimate dynasty possess a written foundational chronicle tracing the dynasty's origin to a divine or semi-divine ancestor. The Japanese court did not have such a document. It commissioned one. Chronicles that resulted were assembled from regional clan traditions, some genuinely ancient, some recent, and integrated into a unified narrative that placed the Yamato clan's ancestral kami, Amaterasu, at the apex of a divine hierarchy and her descendant Jimmu at the head of a continuous imperial line. Put. In this reading, the parallels with Korean, Mongolian and Mesopotamian foundation narratives are explained by two factors. First, the Yamato court was in active diplomatic and cultural contact with the Korean kingdoms throughout the relevant period. The Kojiki itself was compiled within 100 years of the Taika reforms, which were modelled on Tang Chinese institutional structures. Structural template of a heavenly descent in this reading was a known regional convention that the Yamato compilers consciously adapted. Second, the Chinese cosmological framework, heaven above, earth below, mandate descending, was the dominant intellectual framework across East Asia by the 8th century. Any foundational narrative compiled in that period would naturally inherit that framework. This is a serious argument. It is not a weak position. It explains a great deal of the Kojiki's structure without requiring anything to have descended from anywhere. The diffusion mechanism it proposes is documentable. There were Korean scribes at the Yamato court. There was active cultural exchange. What it does not fully explain is the specificity. Diffusion can transmit a template, does not easily transmit the specific detail of 3 sacred regalia objects that are physically maintained in named shrines, with claimed continuous custody from a prehistoric origin. It does not easily transmit the specific name of the landing peak. It does not easily explain why the Japanese version preserves elements absent from any plausible source. The named retainers, the specific clan genealogical attachments, the dry genealogical register. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. Tsuda's reading is the best version of the conventional account. It is not refuted, but it does not exhaustively explain the material it addresses. If the Kojiki is substantially what it appears to be, not in its theological framing, but in its underlying claim of a transmitted memory of contact, then several specific revisions follow. The conventional chronology of Northeast Asian prehistory would require an additional layer. Structural identity between the Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, Manchu, and Mesopotamian foundation accounts would need an explanation that goes beyond diffusion. Closed imperial tombs of the Yamato plain would become objects of unusual archaeological interest. The continuous custody chain of the 3 regalia would need to be taken seriously as a possibly genuine material survival from a deep period. None of this is asserted as proven. The Kojiki is real. Its specific claims are recorded in published English language translations, available since 1882. The structural parallels with continental, Asian and Mesopotamian material are documentable. The question of what generated the parallels is open. The artifact is in the temple in Nagoya. The shrines are still operating. The genealogy is still claimed. Kojiki is at Osu Canon in Nagoya. The oldest copy is the Shinpukuji Bon, handwritten in the early 1370s CE. Nihon Shoki is in the National Diet Library in Tokyo and in scholarly editions in every major Japanological collection in the world. The Samguk Yusa is at the Kyujanga Institute in Seoul. Weld Blundell Prism is at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The mirror is claimed to be at Es. The sword is claimed to be at Atsuta. The jewel is claimed to be at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. No one currently living has seen them. The Imperial Household Agency holds the access. The work of Stephen Langdon on the Sumerian king list, of Irion on the Korean foundation tradition, and of Masazaki Kimura on the underwater monument at Yonaguni, has produced findings that the orthodox account of how the Japanese imperial line came to be has not engaged with on their merits. What Ninigi no Mikoto descended from, and what his great-great-grandson Jimmu inherited, is still open. It has been open since the Kojiki was compiled in 712 CE. It is still open now,